Okay, next on our list is what to do if we get an API error response from our application. And like I said earlier, we're not doing anything with error handling at all at the moment. And if we take a look at our activities controller, and supposing we wanted to get an activity that didn't exist, what are we going to get back from our API in that case? Well, the answer may or may not surprise you. And if we go and take a look at module 10, and we say we want to get a non-existent activity, and we've got a GUID in there, which if it does happen to match one of your activities, then I'd recommend filling out a lottery ticket because the chances of that happening should be just about impossible. So I'll click on send and we don't get an activity back, but we do get a 204 no content. Aha! So it's not an error response. This is actually a successful request. Anything in a 200 range of status responses is a successful request, but we didn't get our activity. So clearly that's not been successful. But why did we see a 204 no content? Well, what we're returning here is the results of this details query, and we pass in the ID to our details handler. And if we open up the details handler and take a look at what it's returning, well, it's returning the result of the find async method that matches that ID. Now, if we take a look at what find async returns, if it doesn't find an activity or an entity, then it's going to return null. And because this is returning null, that's what gets sent back to our API controller. And we're returning effectively null. And null is a 204 no content. There's no content inside a null response. And that's the reason we're seeing a success response. But we don't want that, of course. We want to return a not found, a 404 not found, if we do not find that activity. Now, if we were using API controllers and we were not concerned about making them thin, and we were not using this kind of CQRS pattern, then the normal thing we would do is something like this. We would say var activity equals, and we'll get the activity inside this variable. What we would then do is check to see if the activity is equal to null. And if it is equal to null, then we can return from our API controller a not found response, and then we could return the activity if it is found. And if we go and take a look at what we get back in Postman from this request, and we try again to get a non-existent activity, this time we get a 404 not found, and we see this object response that we get back from our API controller. Aha! That's what we're looking for, but do we really want to add our error handling logic inside our API controllers as we're doing now? Well, not really. I'd still prefer to keep the API controllers thin, even though this is a perfectly viable way of doing so. And what we're going to take a look at next is how, instead of, if I go back to the details handler, instead of returning the activity from here, what we're going to do is return a result object that either will contain an activity object or it will contain null. And we'll also, inside this result object we create, specify a return of a failure type of request so that we can deal with the error handling logic inside our handlers themselves rather than the controller. Because what we cannot do inside our handlers is do a similar thing. And if I was to say var activity equals await, and then I just wanted to check to see if the activity is equal to null, and then I wanted to return not found, well, I don't actually have the option here because, of course, I'm not inside an API controller. One way that we could do this is check to see if the activity is null and then throw an exception and just say activity not found, and this would be throw new exception. And then if we do have the activity, return the activity from here. And then inside the activities controller, we can go back to the logic we had before and keep our controller thin. And let's just return from this. But the problem is now, is if we do it this way, then we would be returning an exception. And exceptions cost a lot more than API responses, a normal error response. Exceptions are heavy. And ideally, you would want to avoid using exceptions for program flow or our control flow, which is what we would be doing here. If we're checking to see if our activity is null, and it is because we don't have one, then effectively we're using exceptions to control the flow of our program. And whilst this is possible, and I did use this approach in the previous version of this course, and I used the argument that exceptions should be exceptional, and this would be because our normal flow of our program is not to send requests to our API for non-existent activities, for example. That would be unusual, and the client would need to go out of their way to find an activity that doesn't exist and send it to our application. But we're not going to do it this way. We're going to look at a different approach, and as I mentioned, what we're going to do is look at creating results objects instead of controlling the flow with exceptions. And we'll take a look at that next.